Doom: The Dark Ages is a bit of a divisive entry after the critically acclaimed Doom Eternal. Although I have dabbled with Doom games before, The Dark Ages was the first one I finished. As always, I have opinions, and I also have benchmarks. Since posting my first look at gaming and path tracing performance on the RX 9070 XT, I've purchased a copy on Steam. That allowed me to benchmark Linux versus Windows. And let me tell you, I was astonished at the outcome. Previously, I was using the Game Pass version, which limited me to Windows, and that was no fun at all. On a side note, these stupid Game Pass versions even obfuscate the save games. I had to start fresh on Steam because I could not copy over my progress. Thank you, Microsoft. I tested on my AMD Ryzen 7800X3D with 32GB of DDR5 6000 megatransfers per second memory and an AMD Radeon RX 9070 XT. Windows 11 was on version 24H2. This time, my Linux installation was Bazzite 42 with KDE Plasma running kernel version 6.14.9. All the results are based on Proton GE 10.8, but the performance was similar to Steam's own Proton Experimental. I tested 1440p and 4K resolutions at Ultra Nightmare, High and Medium quality presets. You will see why I jumped from the very highest preset to high when we get to the benchmark results. This time I relied entirely on the in-game benchmarks, of which there are several. These covered a wide range of areas with various enemies. I think this made them more representative than clearing a battlefield and running around in circles in an empty area for repeatability. The 1440p results were a combination of 2 and 3 passes, and then I averaged the numbers. Since the numbers were incredibly consistent, I ran only 1 pass each at 4K to save time. Location number 1 was Hebeth, the second mission in the game. It consisted of narrow and labyrinthine corridors as well as medium-sized rooms that served as arenas. The native 1440p results already hint at several things. 1. ITTEC 8 maintained a tight consistency between the 1% lows and the average FPS. The difference was minimal and ensured an incredibly tight gaming performance. 2. Windows 11 was noticeably ahead by 10 to 15 FPS across the board. 3. There was a little to be gained in terms of performance by lowering the quality settings. Both operating systems gained at most 10 FPS from the most extreme quality level to the second lowest. The Abyssal Forest at 1440p continued the trend. While Linux's performance remained essentially the same, Windows lost a few frames. It was a more complex outdoor mission with wider areas and foliage, so this was expected. Despite that, the average frame rate still stayed close to 100 FPS. The Spire of Nerathul was an outdoor aerial mission with a few corridors through ruins. The average performance improved slightly and the 1% lows lost some ground at the same time. In this mission, Linux narrowed the gap to Windows to under 10 FPS on average and the 1% lows. Lastly, let's breeze through the 4K numbers. I decided to test this resolution with XeSS quality upscaling enabled. Running Doom: The Dark Ages natively at 4K would at most work with a hard 30 FPS lock, and let's be honest, I would want that. Using quality upscaling raised the performance to a nice high refresh rate experience. At least on Windows 11, Linux continued to lag behind given its slower base performance. The story was the same in the other benchmark locations as well. Windows 11 led by about 10 FPS. In summary, Windows 11 was ahead 14% at 1440p and 12% at 4K. Considering this, placing a greater load on the GPU might bring both operating systems closer together. This would mean that the CPU was the problem, but that's just conjecture. I have not investigated this any further. Before I proceed with my mini review, let me explain my choice of upscaler. Although the 9070 XT could handle 1440p at the native resolution, I preferred to squeeze out more performance by utilizing XeSS at ultra quality. This struck a perfect balance between achieving significant performance gains while maintaining crisp image quality. FSR at 1440p wouldn't cut it. The image would be too soft. Doom: The Dark Ages could benefit significantly from FSR 4, maybe even enabling the use of some path tracing at 1440p. Nvidia users have the luxury of DLSS, of course. If you have a 4K display that only supports 60Hz, like my TV, then XeSS at ultra quality with the Ultra Nightmare graphics preset is the best choice. For me, this locked the frame rate to 60 FPS consistently and produced a pristine image. Only machine learning based upscalers or native rendering can beat the output. Please note that my results are only representative of AMD GPUs. Using an Nvidia graphics card might produce wildly different numbers. As mentioned in the introduction, Doom: The Dark Ages was the first Doom I've ever finished. As such, I don't have any comparison point or past experiences for reference. I've dabbled with Doom 2016 on this channel, but not much further than I've shown in the video. I also played around with Doom 3 many years ago when it was released, primarily out of curiosity for the technology. Therefore, everything I'm about to say is essentially based on an untainted experience. Doom: The Dark Ages was a lot of fun. The performance was flawless, which was a crucial piece of the puzzle. Even though it was considered more of a slow and tanky approach in the Doom sphere, it was still an incredibly fast-paced shooter, and the id Tech 8 engine enabled that. The combat loop was very challenging and frantic, and it felt incredible to play. Most players are probably in it for the higher difficulties, but the setbacks were too annoying to subject myself to that for a prolonged time. I didn't like having to find all the secrets again, but that's personal preference and not an objective criticism of the game. However, it would be a nice QOL feature. The game's main story threw me, Slayer Gameslinger, into an all-out war between the forces of hell and the humans, called the Sentinels. Wars often take place on open battlefields, and so did Doom: The Dark Ages. Instead of narrow industrial corridors, I sprinted across vast areas full of hordes of cannon fodder minions and bullet-spongy enemies. The game's theme was clearly bigger, better, and more badass. Even indoor locations were larger than life to accommodate drawn-out battles against numerous enemies. I came away convinced that the locations had not been the focus of the game. It was all about the combat against large groups of demons, and the levels had been built for that. This left me with the feeling that most locations were barely memorable. Only in the latter third of the game did the level design become a little bit more interesting, although not straying too far from the tried and true corridor to large arena formula the game had established by that point. The goal of Doom: The Dark Ages was frantic action aplenty, and that's what it delivered. Despite this criticism, I think the art design was pretty great. A combination of medieval Gothic architecture and technology worked well. The world was detailed enough not to feel empty without being stuffed to the brim. It was always legible in the heat of battle, and that's what counted. I also enjoyed the physics interaction that created some nice collateral destruction during combat. It was always fun when things broke in the game world because of my slaying around. On the flip side, I was less impressed by the tunes of war. But before I continue, I must preface this by saying that I love this type of music. I was listening to the soundtrack in my car the other day, and while I was writing the script on its own, the music works great. It didn't always fit the game though. The composers tried to create an atmosphere befitting of the Dark Ages, but I think it still sounded too industrial and out of place. The effect could have been different if they had relied more on real medieval instruments rather than trying to achieve the same effect with electronic instruments. I also think the music was way too focused on being fast-paced for the first half of the game. It slowed down to a more deliberate and methodical beat in the latter half and only cranked the speed for emphasis, which worked a lot better. Another thing that bothered me several times was how the music would ramp up and then slow down. It wasn't a ramp in any direction. Suddenly it was there and suddenly it was gone. The integration wasn't always as smooth as I would have liked it to be, especially since the contrast between the ambient music and the combat music was so stark. Electronic ambient sounds versus death metal. I mean, it worked and it banged, and I'm nitpicking here. As I mentioned in the beginning of this paragraph, I like the music on its own. While I'm in the process of complaining, let me briefly touch on the story's presentation. Despite its focus on cinematic storytelling, they still decided to interrupt every mission with a summary. I understand that this is a Doom thing, as I've recently learned by looking at Doom 1 and 2, but when you put this much effort into the cinematic side of your game, why interrupt the flow? I believe this was one of the reasons why I often spaced out and wondered how I got from the end of one mission to the beginning of the next. The continuity was lost, and maybe also not explained well enough, or it was just me, I don't know. Let's put it this way, if there had been an option to skip the summaries and enjoy the game as a contiguous experience, I would have selected it. Doom: The Dark Ages was an entertaining and good game. Unlike me, I think most of the Doom audience relishes in the challenge of the higher difficulties and wants a pumping soundtrack alongside it. And that's exactly what the game delivered. I'm not that kind of player. I enjoy the journey of the story and the world. A bit of challenging combat is great too, but I don't play for the challenge. So I also tend to focus on the other elements of the game, especially the older I get, and that's where my criticism comes from. I'm convinced Doom: The Dark Ages is the way it is on purpose, and that is okay. I still paid for it, had fun, and I don't regret the purchase. Given what I just said, I must also emphasize that 80 euros, which is the listed price here in Germany, is too much for this game. Luckily, sites like Greener Gaming can somehow offer lower prices on software, and I took rare advantage of that. I felt more comfortable with roughly 60 euros. I could have continued milking PC Game Pass for one more month till I finished the game, but being me, I wanted to compare Linux and Windows and maybe in the future move off Windows entirely if this enshittification of the OS continues. On a technical level, Doom: The Dark Ages was the perfect example of game engine optimization, so much so that reducing the quality settings didn't offer much performance improvement. The game's incredibly fast as it is, and I do consider this a positive factor in the pricing discussion. This was probably a sizable chunk of the development budget. It also ran well on Linux, despite being 10 to 15 FPS behind Windows 11. Almost nobody would feel this difference. I had just as much fun on Linux as on Windows. I wasn't missing any of the FPS that Windows could do. On the contrary, I didn't have to deal with some of Windows' user hostile behavior. Unfortunately, I cannot attribute the same level of excellence to the game design and audio. While the quality was very high in both aspects, considering how the Slayer controlled and the quality of the audio delivery, the game design lacked a bit of seasoning to make it more memorable, and the combat music rarely felt like it belonged in the game. Still, and let me emphasize this, it was a fun game. I finished it after all. I even had to start from scratch after purchasing the Steam version. But this makes me excited about experiencing Doom 2016, which many consider to be the best next to Doom Eternal. It seems to come down to how much you enjoy the technical gameplay aspects of Eternal over 2016. Either way, I've heard so much praise for Mick Gordon's work, so I wanted to get Doom: The Dark Ages under my belt first as a baseline, and then dive into 2016 and Eternal. Thank you for watching.